But essentially, we just introduced ourselves, and Sophie put the bread in the oven.
Hello.
In a Dutch oven. The oven's at 500 degrees. We have it covered for the first 20 minutes. And we'll be checking into what's happening in the oven periodically as we go forward. So I'm going to talk a bit about our sourdough starter. A sourdough is a mix of yeast and bacteria. There's some acetic acid bacteria, lactic acid bacteria that give and there are many different kinds of yeasts, and sourdough adapts to the environment that it's in. So everyone's sourdough is going to be different from other people's, depending on where you live. One thing about sourdough cultures, it's very important to name your sourdough, and it's one of the joys of taking care of it.
It's like a houseplant. It's a creature in your home.
It's a lot like a houseplant. We use it as the leavening for our bread, and every time we use it, we need to feed it again. And so I'm going to demonstrate how we mix the sponge for bread and get the proportions, and then I'll show you how to feed the sourdough. You get like 2 pints of water. Mm-hmm. I'm just getting some water measured out. When we make bread, we use a high hydration. That tends to make bigger air bubbles in the finished bread. Our bread usually is around 80% hydration, which means that for every 10 parts of flour, there are 8 parts of water. Typically, when we make a batch of bread, we make enough to make 2 loaves. And so we use a pint of water for each loaf that we're going to make. And then I add about a cup of the sourdough starter. You can see this actually bubbled over. There's these, it's frothing, and it actually escaped a little bit, but that's okay. So we pour in about a cup, and then we'll add enough flour. What I would say is a little bit thicker than pancake batter, but not quite what I would call a dough. And we do this, we form a sponge, as we call it, and then this ferments for about 8 hours. So I'm adding flour that we have sifted with a strainer, and we do this to remove some of the bran. We're using 100% whole wheat that we grew on the farm. So if we remove a little bit of the bran, it acts a little bit more like white flour. If you're blending white flour and whole wheat at home, you can omit the sifting step. For the sponge, for every 2 pints of water plus the starter, we'll add about 2 pounds of flour. Just mixing this up here.
Closer view. Coming
Sure.
in for the stirring. 2.
Just adding some more. Sophie, you want to show everyone what it's starting to look like as we're getting the texture right?
Yeah, maybe I'll bring this up.
Sure.
Towards the... You can see it's getting a little thicker than pancake dough. For the sponge, you still want it to be really wet. We're not making like a dough that you're going to knead right away. It's going to sit and let the sourdough really get cooking.
And in addition to letting the microorganisms in the sourdough multiply, something that's really important that's happening with this long fermentation is that the gluten strands are forming. And so there's protein in wheat, but it doesn't really form gluten until it's been mixed with water. And these proteins coalesce into long chains. And those chains are what will trap air bubbles and make the bread leaven. So generally, the higher the protein content of a wheat, the easier it'll be to get a nice airy loaf. Our wheat is pretty low protein by most baking standards, so we treat it as gently as possible. If you're adding in some commercial light flour, this will be much easier. So once we've got this...
Just to back up for a second, we have a question saying, do we use a wild starter? Maybe some people missed that when we moved over to the other video. So yeah, we're nurturing a sourdough this winter when we've had some time to throw out this project, but in the past, we've done this step with yeast at this point. So you can totally use yeast if you don't have a sourdough going.
But once somebody gives you a piece of sourdough, you can keep it going indefinitely. I haven't done this myself, but I've heard that you can also freeze it or dry some of it out if there's an extended period of time that you don't intend to make bread.
Or you can have someone babysit it for you.
Yeah. So now that we've made the sponge, this will sit for about 8 hours. And during this time, the gluten is forming and the fermentation's happening. And once we come home, so the way that we fit this into our daily routine is we'll typically mix up a sponge in the morning before we go to work, and we'll continue after we get home. So it's usually 8 to 12 hours later. And the reason I'm not giving specific numbers with any of this as far as time is it all depends on how active your starter is, how warm it is, and how long you leave it and what you're feeding it as far as when it's ready to go. But we've found the process to be really flexible. So it's really about making bread making work around your schedule.
We have another question here about what do you feed your starter? Does it matter if it's white or wheat?
I would recommend, we use whole wheat. The person I got our starter from used white flour, and it seemed to work okay. And I'll show you right now how we feed our starter. So I've used about half of this, and I don't wash the jar out or clean it, and so it gets a little bit crusty, but that's okay. So I'll just refill the water, and then I'd like to use a canning funnel. Makes it a little bit easier to not spill, and I'll just feed it a few handfuls to make basically like a thin pancake batter. And so each time I'll use about half of the starter and then refeed it. If I make bread for my feed starter, I can use the excess starter to make pancakes or English muffins or any number of other things. So we just mix that up, and this will bubble away for another few days before I make bread again.
And if we're not going to make for, would you say, like a week or something, you could put it in the fridge.
Yes.
So it's sort of depending again on your schedule, just finding out the ways that it fits into your day and your week.
You want to talk about beans?
Yeah, we were going to do a quick interlude on beans, although the timer just went off.
Yeah.
So we're so sorry the beginning of this video got truncated, but we threw a loaf of bread in the oven first thing. So you can come Let's see. I'll just show you real quick. We had a loaf all ready to go in one of these bannetons, and I flipped it into a preheated cast iron, this big Dutch oven, and we covered it for 20 minutes. So there's a lot of humidity. It's getting extra hot. You can see it at that stage. This really allows the crust to develop with all that humidity, but you want the crust to eventually brown. So we uncover it. I'm going to pop it back in the oven. And we found that covered for 20 minutes is awesome, and then we get a really good crust if we still leave it at 500 for 10 more minutes. And then we'll do an additional 10 minutes for the end of the bake with it lowered to like 420, 425. Kind of just lets the inside cook through all the way. This talk was mostly about bread, but we also said we would talk a little bit about dried beans. We also grow some dried beans on the farm, and we love to eat beans of all types. It's fun. There's so many different varieties. And to be the return of the dry bean in this era. So I'll just talk about a couple considerations. Again, like just figuring out how to build it into your schedule. We usually feed a bunch of people for farm lunch. We eat a lot of beans. So I like to do a big batch of beans, and then I'll freeze it in pints or quart, like old yogurt containers. So you can just grab a quart out of the freezer when you know that you're going to have beans for lunch or something like that. So I usually do a big pot at a time, but it doesn't really matter. You can just pick through your beans. It's nice to watch for, debris or stones. It can happen from how the beans are harvested. Give them a little look over. I just soak them for whatever makes sense for my day overnight, or soak them in the morning if I'm going to cook them that evening. Around 8 hours is a good bet if you can build that time into your day. And these beans are going to, I've got some black beans soaking here right now. These are going to expand by 3 times. You want to give it plenty of water to soak in. I like to use cold water because their skins don't get really wrinkly really fast. And then it's generally advised to change the rinse water or the soaking water. I think it helps with flatulence, if that is a concern, to change that water over. And then this hasn't been soaking for very long, so I'm not going to put these on the stove yet. But when it's time to do that, you just cover them with a couple inches of water. And for cook time, it really depends on how or when the beans were dried. So these black beans are still perfectly delicious, but we grew them in 2017. So they need to cook for almost an hour. And I kind of keep an eye on them. You bring it to a boil and then just gentle simmer after that. And test them, see if they're done as you go. The beans we grew this year, which are a really lovely Italian cranberry variety, they cook in like 20 minutes. And the first time I cooked them, I was shocked how fast they went. So it's important to keep an eye and know what beans you're using if you can. I like to salt my beans as I'm cooking them. So I add the salt in at the beginning because I think it kind of lends to a more flavorful bean in the end. Some people salt at the end, which is also fine. But I think it's nice if the broth and the beans are all sort of like salty the whole way through. Nice balance. And then, then from there on, you can just pull them out of the freezer or the fridge and do all kinds of things. So that's how we do beans. Again, so many different ways to do all these things, but that's how we figured out how to add it into our very busy life.
It's another way where a little bit of planning ahead with soaking them in the morning and then cooking them when we come home makes it a lot more convenient. So now we can imagine that 8 hours has just passed, and this is what the sponge now looks like. It's got a lot of bubbles in it, and you can see it's almost a little bit stretchy. Like when it starts to flow, you can see it making little strands, and that's a good sign. That's showing that there's some good gluten development. You really want to wait for it to have a good smell and for it to be very, very bubbly. So the next step, we add salt and then a little bit more flour so that it's an easier to work with dough. and will shape the loaves. So I use about 2 teaspoons of salt per loaf. So with that 2 loaf batch, that would be 4 teaspoons. I would not recommend using an iodized salt, but either kosher salt or a sea salt will work great.
You just put a tube. We used this before.
No, it's a single loaf. Oh. And it's a little tricky to not add too much flour at this stage. Sophie, you want to grab the computer?
Yeah. I'm always one to add in a ton of flour because I love to knead. But this winter, we've really tried to challenge ourselves to use as little flour as possible. And it really has made for a lovely, bubbly crumb.
So it's still a little too wet right now. I'm going to add a little bit more flour. And I would recommend using a scale the first couple times you do this with that target of 80% hydration. It may be different with whatever flour you're using. I recommend experimenting till you get something that you really like. But even bread that doesn't come out as the bread of your dreams, I guarantee will be delicious. And it's kind of fun to just keep experimenting, and it's pretty forgiving.
Yeah, and the more practice you have and the more experience you have with the flours you're using, you kind of get a sense for it over time. It's something it's hard to teach, really. Like, you really just have to go through the motions and feel for it.
So part of the reason for shaping loaves is to align the gluten strands in a way to make kind of a balloon that holds gas bubbles. And to do that, we fold the dough in on itself repeatedly. So you'll see I'm just sort of folding it in, and it's sagging and spreading out. I'm folding it again.
It's very wet.
This is still a little too wet.
Do you want to talk about how you're not really kneading it at all?
Right. We don't really need, and also this dough is too wet generally to knead very well. But the folding process does basically the same thing as you would be doing in a kneaded type bread. This is also a stage where if we wanted to have pizza dough, I would make a slightly stiffer dough and also add in some olive oil. Or if I wanted to make like a breakfast type loaf, I would add in some rye flour and maybe some nuts or sunflower seeds and raisins and put it in a regular square loaf pan and bake it at a lower temperature. Sometimes I'll do that if we come home too late and don't want to wait for the bread to rise as much, or if for whatever reason we couldn't get it baked and it fermented way too long over another night. But now you'll see this is sort of nice and round, and I need to keep it moving or it'll stick to my hand. But we flour the banneton, this basket, really liberally. And for years, we just used a mixing bowl that we sprinkled with flour inside, and that worked okay too.
You can find these at specialty kitchen stores or online, and they're really affordable, actually. And once we really got into a practice of bread baking, it was a really nice purchase to make because they do make just beautiful loaves.
And then we plop it in, and I'll cover it with a plate, and this will wait for about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how warm it is, before it is ready to bake.
We got a question about why we don't use iodized salt.
I honestly don't know, but it's something that I read somewhere once and just never have.
I wonder if it messes with the yeast.
Yeah, I wonder. And it's totally, if iodized salt is what you have in the house, it's totally worth trying it. I don't know the rhyme or reason to that. Well,
we've got 2 minutes left on this loaf.
So
or on the
like I said before, the sourdough is really nice if you're not making bread regularly to make pancakes. I've also heard of using it to do English muffins, and I've even tried making Ethiopian flatbread injera, which is basically the thin starter that's cooked on a hot griddle. And I've actually gotten something that's pretty similar to what I've had in Ethiopian restaurants, and it's pretty delicious.
Quick introduction. So that loaf went for another 10 minutes uncovered to get a really nice, good crust. And now we're dropping it to 420 for another 10 minutes, which kind of just lets the whole thing finish baking, gets baked to the center without that outside getting too brown. So.
Another thing that we do that kind of makes an already economical food more economical is when we are slicing bread, it's usually on our cutting board here, and I always have a bowl handy that I sweep the breadcrumbs into. And if there are crusts that fall off or little pieces of bread that don't get eaten and go stale, we just keep those in a bowl that's always on the counter. And periodically I will grind them up in this, which is unfortunately named Corona grain mill. That's originally made for grinding wet corn for tortillas. This is a really useful tool to have in the kitchen. It's pretty inexpensive. I bought mine through a beer brewing website. But you could use a food processor or even put bread crusts in a bag and hit them with a rolling pin. But having breadcrumbs on hand is really nice in the kitchen, and it's nice to have some real bread.
Yeah, they're super flavorful.
Is there another? Oh, great. One of our friends just commented that King Arthur has recipes for using extra starter. So the possibilities are endless.
We have another 10 minutes on this final loaf, or a little less than 10 minutes. Yeah, do you want to go over the...
Sure.
If you guys want to take a screenshot or some quick scribbled notes.
I wish that I was more technologically advanced and got this into digital form, but I wrote out the basic process that we use. And so I don't know if you can take a screenshot or notes, but this is a actually chronological version of what we've been jumping around for the last few minutes. So while we're waiting for that loaf to come out of the oven, are there any questions? We kind of blasted through our material pretty quickly, which I guess is a good sign because we haven't made it too complicated.
Do you want to talk a little bit about growing wheat? And then if any of you guys have questions, shoot them our way and we'll answer them in these last few minutes before the loaf's done.
Sure. So we grow wheat as part of our crop rotation. We grow 3 or 4 acres of vegetables every year, and we specialize in storage crops that we market throughout the winter. And we grow winter wheat, which we plant in the fall. And one of the biggest advantages to our soil and our crop rotation to growing grain is that it makes it very easy to establish a legume cover crop. So every March, I'll go out and I'll broadcast clover seed into the young wheat plants that have gone dormant through the winter. And after we harvest the wheat, the clover takes over and grows really well. So it's kind of like a relay crop of the wheat grows and protects the soil after the vegetable crop is done, protects the soil all winter, and midsummer we harvest the wheat and the clover takes over, fixing nitrogen and really helping the soil out. And then we'll go back into vegetables the next year.
All right, we have a couple more questions coming in. One is from your cousin in New York City. All right, way to tune in.
Hey, Evelyn.
Is it okay to cover With a moist dish towel instead of a plate.
Yes, it is. I've found that it tends to dry out, and also, especially when the air is already cold, as the water on the dish towel evaporates, it will actually cool your bread down. So I've kind of abandoned using a wet towel. Also, the dough will stick to it much more readily, and that can be a hassle to get the dish towel cleaned.
And then we've got 2 questions about starting a sourdough from scratch. We inherited our sourdough, which is probably the best way to do it. If you can adopt a piece, it's constantly growing, so you can share it widely. So if you know someone who has a sourdough starter, that's definitely the best way to do it.
There's a pretty in-depth discussion of starting sourdoughs in this excellent book by Sarah Katz, who was our keynote speaker at the NOFA Summer Conference. And so I recommend this. I did start one sourdough in college in my dorm room, and it was a modest success. I used wild grapes as the initial fruit, the initial source for yeast, which made for a pretty smelly dorm room, but it did bubble.
So we harvest our grain with a combine, a really old 1950s combine, but you can grow your own wheat at home and hand harvest it. The cool thing about wheat, in comparison to other grains, is it threshes out of its hull, so it's pretty easy to get the food without too much mechanization, which is really cool. We get ours tested at the UVM grain lab every fall for anything that's wrong with the grain, mycotoxins, etc., but also to find out the baking quality, the protein, and the falling numbers. And it's been interesting over the years, like a really wet year versus a dry year, our protein really will shift, even with the same variety. And then it's also been cool to branch out and plant other and see how they react.
So
I think we could probably hold this.
Yeah, we'll take the bread out of the oven in a minute.
This is looking good. So, moment of truth. This is the loaf we put in at the beginning, which got missed on this video, but you can see there's nice little flour rings with banneton. This had a big oven spring. That's where it's all cracked. If you're using white flour, a lot of people get fancy with razor blades and make those gorgeous designs. We tried that, but the way our dough seems to spring in the oven with the flour that we're using, it would like break off and the top crust would all come out. So we just leave it like this. It's not quite as gorgeous, but it's more effectual.
And we find that the bread slices up way better if we let it fully cool first. But I'm going to slice into a loaf of bread that I baked yesterday, so you can see what the crumb looks like. So this is with a very low protein whole wheat that we've grown. And it's not the tallest loaf, it's not the airiest loaf, but we think it's really delicious and it provides a lot of sustenance for us.
Yeah, it really fills you up compared to white, purely white flour bread. We can have a couple slices in the morning and good till lunch, which is very busy farmers. It's really nice to have really, tasty, nutritious, hold you for a while bread on hand.
So unless there are some other questions, I think we've kind of covered what we set out to. And I hope you all are brave and try baking bread. I hope it's a rewarding endeavor for you all.
Yeah, enjoy. And feel free to reach out with any questions.